And this is NPR, Northampton Poetry Radio, with our Poet Laureate, Rich Michelson. Rich.
Hey, thanks, everybody. So we are here for our second annual Mark Doty visit. Mark is visiting, as he often does in the summer, for the Juniper Summer Writers Institute at UMass. A quick recap. I want to get through this quick. Whiting Writers Award, Los Angeles Times Book Award, T.S. Eliot Prize, National Book Award. What I'm going to do next time you visit is I'm going to name the awards you haven't won, and that way we'll be quicker. Philip Levine, our last National Poet Laureate. If it were mine to invent the poet to complete the century of William Carlos Williams and Wallace Stevens, I would create Mark Doty. Wow, you don't get better than that. And as important, over 5,000 friends on Facebook. And about...
now we're talking.
Yeah, now we're talking. And about 1 minute after the Supreme Court decision yesterday, you were texted. Can I jump in and ask you about that? Is that okay?
Sure. I happened to be walking into Starbucks to get a cup of coffee before going to teach when the Supreme Court decision broke. And about a minute later, there I was putting a lid on my latte when a text showed up, from the man in my life saying, will you marry me? And I wept. A few minutes later, put a note on Facebook telling the world about telling my 5,000 friends about how I felt, and received waves of congratulations before I have said yes. I haven't even said yes yet. I'm still thinking about it.
I haven't said yes.
People kept writing, well, what did you say? I haven't answered because, you don't want to take these things lightly. Having been an impulsive person most of my life, I thought I should think about this for a little bit. But we're thinking and feeling our way forward, and it was a wonderful moment to receive a proposal.
Oh.
Well, I think congratulations are in order. Congratulations.
Congratulations are in order. Jumping to poetry from this, because in a sense, you have been one of the most prominent gay poets of my generation, of our time. What do you think that poetry has had an effect on the general population? You're a role model now for a lot of young poets, and I'm wondering, has poetry weighed in, helped move the Supreme Court in this direction? Have we made the social atmosphere different?
I'd like to say that Ruth Ginsburg and Kennedy were passing my book, hand to hand. I think maybe poetry is part of the great wave of change in our culture. When I started out practicing as a poet, there were very few serious poets publishing who were self-identified as gay and who talked about same-sex love in their work. That has changed enormously, and I see it particularly in the academy. I've made my living most of my life as a teacher, and when I started out, there were very few self-identified gay students in my classes. That's changed radically. The poetry world has become a more open place, just as our culture has become a more open place.
Mm-hmm. I wonder about that. Can I ask you about that, Mark Doty? Because think back, Ginsburg and Edward Field, yes. And there have been out gay poets for a long time, and really poetry and poets, I think, were in some ways at the forefront of the movement for social change and for equality. So I think it's not necessarily that poetry has just been part of the wave. I think it's been a leader of this cultural shift.
Well, I think that's a good point. And those poets have sort of been, levers. They've been cracking open the tacit agreement that everybody was heterosexual so that we could see, what else was going on in the culture. However, until fairly recently, poets who were gay wrote about sex in order to identify the point of difference. We would say, if that's what separates us from the rest of the culture, we're going to emphasize that.
Right. Edward Field was not writing about being gay or that experience, even though he was very much a New York City, Greenwich Village kind of poet. You don't see that much in his early poetry.
Yeah. It took a while. So it seems to me now that gay and lesbian poets have an enormous amount of freedom to talk about all of our lives in a way that we lacked some years ago. It's a much more open, a permissive atmosphere in the world of poetry where we can address every aspect of experience.
And how's that going in Topeka, Kansas? And
it's happening.
Really?
Right. We don't know if Topeka's listening, but it's happening.
Yeah. Do you have, because you have such a wide readership, and you have one of the widest readership, plus you're very active on social media, do you have a responsibility? Does it ever occur to you that people are waiting for your next book, listening to what you say? Even after 9/11, you wrote a very touching essay about that when you're writing now, as opposed to when you were writing 30 years ago, do you feel any sense of responsibility either as a poet or as a person?
Well, I think you can't help but feel a sense of responsibility if you know people are listening. However, and you know this, Rich, as an artist, when you sit down to compose, you sit down to create, you really have to let responsibility go. All of the voices that say you should do this, you must do that, have to be banished from your workplace so that you have room to play.
Right. You're listening to NPR, Northampton Poetry Radio, on WHMP, the Bill Newman Show. And then
let's say, following up on that, though,
okay.
After you've played, after you have created and let loose the imagination without restriction or responsibility, then consciousness has to come to bear on what you've done.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything you wouldn't publish?
I would not publish something that might... shall we say, you judge another person, condemn, criticize, incriminate another person. I don't have any trouble incriminating myself or embarrassing myself, but I want to be careful with people I know. I think we do have that responsibility.
Was there a time in your poetry, Mark Doty, where you felt like you couldn't write or publish something that you wanted to because of the way society was viewing homosexuality? I remember... first, coming out and struggling with a love poem. And in my poem, I talked about the, sort of general one of those I and you poems, with music and roses and candles, and you couldn't tell who was who. And then suddenly I was talking about the feeling of having beard burn, of having a cheek flushed and heated by the scrape of someone else's stubble. And suddenly I was shocked. Is my poem now about homosexuality? Is my poem about loving a man? It can no longer be about this particular moment or this relationship, but suddenly it's become a poem whose real subject is political. And that was a shock to me and a difficult thing to negotiate.
All right. I have so many questions, and it's fascinating to talk to you, but let's stick in a poem or two, okay? Sure. So people, I don't want time to disappear and us not have a chance to read.
Well, I can't resist today because our nation has just removed enormous impediment. I want to turn to one of the great love poems of all time. Okay, it's Shakespeare. It's Sonnet 116, and here we go. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh, no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out, even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved.
Boy,
forever, our nation has been not just admitting impediment, but creating impediment, and trying to alter love where it in fact existed. And that poem is such a beautiful example, although I doubt that Shakespeare quite meant it this way, of the embrace of all sorts of marriage, yes?
Right. Well, although most people, I think critical consensus is that was written to a man. These days, I think many critics would say, you've raised a high bar for yourself, but I'm not going to let you go without reading a poem or two by Mark Doty.
How about I read you a new poem, which is, I will admit, a love poem to my dog, Ned. 3-year-old golden
You're living out all of Republican fears right now.
It's a platonic relationship.
Oh, thank God.
Thus far, and we're not planning to marry. Here we go. Deep Lane. June 23rd, evening of the first fireflies. We're walking in the cemetery down the road, and I look up from my distracted study of whatever, an unfocused gaze somewhere a few feet ahead of my shoes, and see that Ned has run on, with the champagne plume of his tail held especially high, his head erect, which is often a sign that he has something he believes he is not allowed to have. And in the gathering twilight, what is it that is gathered? Who is doing the harvesting? I can make out that the long horizontal between his lovely jaws is one of the 4 stakes planted on the slope to indicate where the backhoe will dig a new grave. Of course, my impulse is to run after him, to replace the marker, out of respect for the rule that we won't desecrate the tombs, or at least for the particular knowledge of those who knew the woman, whose name inks a placard in the rectangle claimed for the 4 poles of vanishing, 3 poles now, and how it's within their recollection, their gathering, shall live. Evening of memory. Spark lamps in the grass. I stand and watch him go in his wild figure eights. I say, you run, darling. You tear up that hill.
Mark Doty.
Thanks.
Deep Lane. Deep Lane, you have a forthcoming book?
I have a forthcoming book called Deep Lane. Deep Lane is a little road near a house I have out in Long Island. The actual road is perfectly lovely, but what I really like is the name, the two monosyllables, the long E, the long A, the feeling of descent and going forward somehow. So I wrote a Deep Lane poem, and I wasn't satisfied, and I wrote another, and now I have about 15 of them, and they became the core of this manuscript.
When will that be published?
Well, I'll be finished, I hope, in a few weeks. It's very close to the end, and then about a year from now.
Deep Lane. You're listening to Mark Doty on NPR, Northampton Poetry Radio, on HMP, the Bill Newman Show.
Rich Michelson, Mark Doty. Thanks so much. Mark, will you be back next summer?
Indeed.
Yes, I have more questions
Couldn't
that I
stay
didn't
away
get
from
to.
NPR.
So.
Thanks,
gentlemen.
We look forward to having you back then, if not before. Mark
Happy
Doty,
Supreme
Rich
Court
Michelson.
decision to everyone.